intervention. So we are very topical at the moment. On seeking clarification from the moderator on tonight's topic, I understand that the broader definition for administrative state is used to include not just administrators, but the rise of the executive branch in the Commonwealth Caribbean. The other important definition from the proposition is the phrase democratic principles. Now, as the name suggests, these principles emanate from a country governed by democratic as opposed to socialist or communist ideologies that you would find in countries such as China, Cuba, or North Korea. President Abraham Lincoln famously defined democracy in a very succinct manner as government of the people, by the people, for the people. Political author Larry Diamond described in his book, What is Democracy, published in 2016, that democracy consists of 4 key elements: a political system for choosing and replacing the government through free and fair elections, the active participation of the people as citizens in political and civic life, protection of human rights to all citizens and residents, and the rule of law, which is the laws and procedures applied equally to all citizens. Now, democratic principles, there are many of them, and we've heard about accountability and transparency referred to today. I will add a few others. The rule of law basically means that no one is above the law, and in terms of having to apply the law, it must be applied equally with something called due process, meaning that if you are accused of a crime, for example, you must have the specific details of that crime and a proper opportunity to defend yourself. We also speak about freedom of election and being elected, freedom of assembly and political participation, freedom of speech, expression, and other fundamental rights and privileges. And of course, the most important principle of all, the separation of powers doctrine. The separation of powers doctrine is key to a democracy. And what this basically means is that there are 3 arms of state whose roles are designed to be separate to ensure a democratic state. The legislature or parliament is responsible for making laws, the executive for implementing those laws and governing the country, whilst the judiciary should apply, enforce, and interpret the law. In the Caribbean, there is really little separation between the legislature and the executive, particularly where there is no opposition or the government benches in parliament have enough members to make up a special majority that is more than 2/3 of the seat in parliament. Now, addressing the proposition, the rise of the administrative state and the decline of democratic principles within this context, it has been my experience that there's no straightforward or uniform answer to this question. There are, Mr. Moderator, many variables at play. One's response could be supportive of or debunk the proposition depending on context, country, and even the state of affairs of a country at a particular time. My qualified response is that the administrative state's rise can only lead to a decline in democracy and democratic principles if left unchecked. That is, if the citizens and residents allow it. Now, the administrative state's purpose was to increase efficiency by placing specific roles and subsidiary rule-making responsibilities in the executive, that is in ministers of government hands, or an elected body more in touch with the specific situation, leaving macro legislative and political decisions to the legislature. However, the administrative state often attempts to rule by testing its limits or overreaching, and this is nothing that is new to our region. It is up to the people of a democratic state to push back using its most lethal weapon, the judiciary, armed with the separation of powers doctrine to maintain democratic balance. And now I will try to give you some examples of cases throughout the region in which some of these principles were tested and how they were resolved by the judiciary. When speaking about the freedom of election and being elected, in the Caribbean, the right to vote is sacrosanct, and it is protected by the Constitution and in some cases, what we call ordinary legislation passed by Parliament. Implicit in that right is also the right to choose a government based on the majority rule principle or first past the post system. But in some countries, the minister in charge of elections, the supervisor of elections, the Constituency Boundaries Commission, or the Electoral Commission can have significant powers in regulating, one, who qualifies to run for election or who votes. They can also determine where you vote or whether your vote has equal weight to someone voting in another constituency, for example. In recent times, Guyana has shown us how the administrative state can, if left unchecked, interfere with our democratic process. In 2020, the Caribbean Court of Justice had to issue an order restraining Guyana's Elections Commission, usually known as GCOM, from declaring the outcome of a recount of the votes cast in the country's 2nd of March general elections. The CCJ did so pending a challenge against the country's chief election officer's decision to invalidate nearly 25%, that is over 115,000 votes of the votes cast. In this case, the then opposition, the People's Progressive Party, challenged the chief elections officer report to GCOM, stating that it was contrary to the directions given by GCOM, and it did not reflect the results of the recount process as certified by the staff and witnessed by representatives of the political parties. This allegation's effect is that an elected representative could have been based not on a majority vote, but on the chief elections officer's interpretation of those votes, on which should be counted after it has been certified and agreed by the political parties on who would have been first past the post. The chief elections officer's invalidation could have resulted with the person with the least support at the polls being declared as the elected official. This allegation raised the quintessential threat to democracy. And on the 9th of July 2020, the CCJ, sitting as a full court, unanimously ruled that the 23rd June report of the chief election officer was invalid. In fairness, the chief elections officer made this report based on an interpretation of Article 177, subsection 2 of the Constitution, which stated that if more votes were cast in choosing who is the representative, one should look at who more votes were casted in favor of. That was interpreted to mean more valid votes, and with the chief election officer determining what is a valid vote. The CCJ found that a ballot's integrity or how a vote was procured should not be questioned beyond the transparent validation exercise of a count or recount in the presence of representatives from both political parties that participated. The CCJ found that any questions that are raised thereafter should only be raised by way of an election petition before the High Court. And so this was a case where, but for the actions of the opposition to take up this issue before the judiciary, based on the separation of powers doctrine, the administrative state could have threatened the democracy of Guyana at that time. But as far as back as 1978, the administrative state have threatened democracy, particularly with our electoral system. In Jamaica, for example, there is a case known as the Attorney General for Jamaica and others against Donald Thompson, in which there was a by-election for the constituency of St. Andrews. Nomination day was held. There were 7 candidates that put up their papers for nomination. 6 of those candidates had the same surname, Thompson, including the plaintiff. The plaintiff and the 5th defendant both were the only 2 that were processed and their applications accepted by a returning officer. The returning officer would be a member of the executive arm and therefore a member of the administrative state. After this returning officer deemed Mr. Donald Thompson, the plaintiff's papers to be in order, the government issued a 2nd nomination day and appointed us a different returning officer. The plaintiff did not participate in the 2nd nomination day as he deemed it to be unlawful, but the 2nd returning officer processed nominations for that day, including that of the defendant. and during the election prohibited the plaintiff, Mr. Donald Thompson, from participating in the election process. Therefore, his right to stand for elections, having been qualified, was denied. Mr. Donald Thompson moved to court trying to get an injunction, but because of the nature of election law, the courts found that he could do nothing until after elections by launching a petition. And so that is a circumstance where the administrative state has, operated in such a way that it did not work in favor of democracy at that particular point in time. In as recent as 2019, in the country of St. Kitts and Nevis, a public servant also faced challenges from the administrative state when he tried to participate in the political process by throwing his hat in the ring. Mr. Leon Nelson against the Attorney General is a case that is now widely used in our jurisdiction. It was decided in March 2019, and I had the pleasure of representing Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson is a customs officer. He is an accountant at the Customs Department, St. Kitts, and prior to the federal elections held in 2020, declared his intention to run against the Prime Minister. Mr. Nelson then became aware that the Public Service Commission, part of the administrative state, had issued disciplinary charges against him for participating in political activity contrary to a statutory rule and order, which is a rule made by the executive, mainly the minister in charge of human resources. Mr. Natter challenged these rules and regulations as being unconstitutional and prohibiting his right to engage in political activities and his right to freedom of choice. The court agreed with us and struck down those rules and regulations which were made by the executive. Of course, this matter was defended by the Attorney General, who's also a member of the executive. In Antigua, a similar occurrence happened in 1999, where Mr. De Freitas, who was a civil servant, participated in a peaceful march against government corruption, and he was suspended from his work by the Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Agriculture. Mr. De Freitas took his case all the way up to the Privy Council, and the Privy Council ruled that to carte blanche prohibit public servants from participating in the electoral process, including to put themselves up for election, was unconstitutional, and struck down that legislation which would have been made by the executive branch. Freedom of speech has also been threatened more often than not by the administrative state, and in particular the executive. For example, in the famous case of the Attorney General St. Christopher Nevis and Reynolds, which was decided in 1979, a case that all law students learn in year one constitutional law, a state of emergency was declared in St. Kitts and Nevis. And Mr. Reynolds, who was an advocate for the then opposition, was protesting against the government. During a state of emergency, the government, and in particular the police, have very wide powers. Mr. Reynolds was apprehended. He was arrested and detained for more than 14 days without any charge or reasonable justification. Mr. Reynolds would have sued, and the Privy Council found that he should not only get damages, but exemplary damages. There are also many cases throughout the region which shows that during election, the administrative state in the form of state-owned media tend to suppress the views of the opposition to favor that of the government, which of course affects one's ability to properly choose between the parties vying for political office. That also happened in St. Kitts in 2020, in which the court found that the opposition's right to the state media was denied and made a declaration to that effect. There are many other cases that can go on. There's ASAFAN and the Comptroller of Customs, where the Comptroller of Customs was given the right to determine what other taxes one should have to pay when importing goods, and the courts found that was unconstitutional. A Comptroller of Customs must not be able to give an arbitrary figure on what you should be charged for importing goods. And lastly, in 2018, there's a case of Damien Kelsick against Kirsten Petty in St. Kitts, in which the minister in charge of the companies and the minister in charge of state affairs passed a law which made individuals operating businesses subjected to the Companies Act. Mr. Kelsick challenged it because there was a threat to charge him with criminal prosecutions for not filing audited returns. And the court found that such an act was ultra vires. The executive had gone beyond the powers granted to them to make law, and it was struck down. So while there are many attempts to threaten the democratic principles which govern our region, I feel confident that if individuals push back and use the judiciary in the manner in which it was meant, then the administrative state can be kept in check. And if the individuals that occupy these positions are selected properly and exercise their rights within the confines of the powers given to them, there can be proper balance between both and a better democracy. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Ms. Suku Bob. And what I appreciated about your presentation is that you highlighted that these attempts to threaten the principles of democracy rather stems back as early as 1978 in the Donald Thompson case and 79 in the Reynolds case throughout our Caribbean region. And what I also liked the fact, or at least what I took away from your presentation, is that rather the only persons who are the gatekeepers or the persons who are the important stakeholders, if they rather do not check this threat on the principles of democracy, then that is when the administrative state is left to its own devices. And that gatekeeper is rather the judiciary, that third arm or the third limb of the separation doctrine. So I thank you. Tyson, I don't know if you have anything to add to my comment, but it seems that certainly the rise of an administrative state and that threat towards or on the principles of democracy can only happen and can only be awry if we have that third limb, the judiciary, which I coined them as the gatekeeper, if they do not put the administrative state in check.
Actually, Tamar, this brought me and which leads me to our next guest speaker, Mrs. Maxine McLean. Um, a research paper that I would have done for my graduate studies, it said here, regardless, Tocqueville, Alexis de Tocqueville is a French philosopher who would have traveled to the US, who studied the US democratic system. And in analyzing the same context of the administrative state, he said that Tocqueville saw the relationship between liberty, democracy, and equality in democracy. And the relationship consisting citizens wanting equality over their liberty in comparison to those who desired liberty over equality. So having the latter forfeiting the basic rights for the greater good. So when we look at the context of the rise of administrative state, what Mrs. Suku Bob has stated, we have to see it's only as much as we allow it to. And that brings us to the views of our next speaker, Mrs. Maxine McLean, who is a Barbadian. Ms. McLean is a management consultant who is now retired, who founded her own consulting firm, Strategic Interventions Incorporated, in 1999. She is a former lecturer in the Department of Management Studies at the University of the West Indies, Cavell campus, where she taught for 17 and a half years. She mentioned to me that she taught many Bahamians over the years, so some persons actually may be on this call who would have sat in a class. She's a graduate of the University of the West Indies Cavell campus, where she received her upper second class honors in public administration in 1978. I did not know that, and I'm happy that another public administration major there. She was awarded an OAS fellowship in 1979 and to do graduate work in Ohio University, where she received her MBA in 1981 and the MA in International Affairs in 1982. She also received a Fulbright fellowship to Louisiana State University in 1986. Fast forward to recent times, Ms. McLean was invited to join the cabinet of the former Prime Minister of Barbados, the Honorable Mr. David Thompson, as a minister in the office of the Prime Minister in January 2008, and was appointed leader of government business in the Senate. On November 24th, Senator McLean was appointed Minister of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade and served in both capacities until May 24th, 2018. As a Minister of Government, her responsibilities included various areas, most notably in immigration, data processing department, provided information and communication and technology, directions to various government ministries, departments, to public sector agencies, and the list goes on. Mrs. McLean, Ms. McLean participated in training and mentorship programs of Youth Entrepreneurship Scheme for the Ministry of Education, Youth Affairs for Barbados, and the mentorship program for the Youth Business Trust. She's a past president of the City of Bridgetown Cooperative Credit Union and a former member of the board and supervisory committee of the credit union. In 2019, she was one of the executive producers of movie Joseph, which was shot in Jamaica, Barbados, and 3 cities in Ghana. This has sparked interest in further collaboration with creatives in Ghana and Nigeria. Please help me in welcoming Ms. Maxine McLean. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good evening. I want to thank you for your kind invitation to have me participate in this evening's discussion. And I also want to say to my fellow panelists, good evening. And I note Ms. Suku Bob's comment that the panel is made up of three females. And what I would do, because usually in a session like this where I will try to build on what went before, and therefore I will modify some of what I had intended to say. And I want to thank Ms. Suku Bob very much for what I consider to be a very comprehensive and in-depth discussion from what I would call an important and critical legal perspective. And what I therefore will try to do is to speak from what I would call the perspective of a layperson, in the sense that I may use some simpler definitions. So without spending too much time, I think it is important for me from that perspective to share with you what I see to be some simple definitions, as I think it is important that I set my contribution within the framework of my chosen definitions of the 2 key concepts, administrative state and democracy. And a definition of democracy in turn will give rise to the articulation of some of the what I see as the fundamental principles. And I was also happy to see that in her presentation, she shared one of the definitions or categorizations that I will share with you. But if I go to the publication, The Administrative State by Dwight Waldo, a publication of several decades ago, he defines, and I chose this because of its simplicity and the suitability for my purpose. He defines the administrative state as largely unaccountable bureaucracy that we commonly refer to as the administrative state. And in her presentation, she elaborated on the several elements of the administrative state, and as such, and of that bureaucracy, or the several bureaucracies which constitute the state. So I wouldn't go through those in detail. But he argues in the book, of course, that democratic states are indeed underpinned by professional and political bureaucracies, and that scientific management and efficiency is not the core idea of government bureaucracy, but rather it is a service to the public. So in a sense, I would suggest that the 2 things, and as we clearly heard, there's a nexus and a necessary connection between the 2 concepts and ultimately between administrative state, and I will use the word bureaucracy because that's how I've defined it in its very broad sense. Similarly, democracy, as we know, is defined as a political system where eligible citizens participate directly or indirectly. And I say eligible citizens because if I take you back into the early 50s in Barbados, people could only vote if they were propertied. In recent times, of course, in 51, I think we would have had adult suffrage, and then that became the right of all persons, initially 21 years, and in more recent times, in around 1971, persons 18 years and younger. And so I would say that, again, if we talk about democracies, there are several types of democracies. What we in the Caribbean, and particularly within CARICOM, our democracy is typified by what we can describe as representative democracy. This, of course, is part of the inherited British Westminster system. And supposedly, ideally, power and civic responsibility are supposed to be exercised by the citizen. And to that extent, I certainly agree with Ms. Sukubob that when we seek to draw a conclusion, as I will later, in relation to the topic about whether the rise of bureaucracy or the admin state, as I said, I will use those words interchangeably, causes or sees the decline in democratic principles, and it is not a simple yes or no situation. But in exploring the two concepts, democracy and the administrative state, I see democracy as the what of society, as what a society or a people seek to achieve. The admin state or the bureaucracy is the how of achieving desired outcomes, actions, impacts, etc. And so the idea is that one exists to achieve certain outcomes, and the other is the methods, the systems, the institutions by which those desired outcomes are supposedly achieved. So we're talking outcomes, actions, impacts, etc. And as such, the admin state or bureaucracy, as I keep referring to it, must be seen as a means to an end and not an end in itself. And that is critical, because if we lose sight of that, whether we be in the citizens in whose interest it seeks to serve, or if we mean the people who constitute the admin state, lose sight of the fact that they are not an end in themselves, but a means to an end, then perhaps that will help us to answer the question of whether it is an obvious or necessary decline, or whether or not a proper functioning admin state, or elements of the admin state would serve to foster and build and reinforce democratic principles. So the question is, how is this, in essence then, as I said, to reiterate the point, a democracy which is characterized by, or which is expected to adhere to a set of fundamental principles, exists to address the needs of citizens of that society. The question is, how is this made real? Or put another way, how is democracy operationalized? In other words, how do we bring those principles alive? And I think I will give you a list of some of what I consider to be the key principles. And for the purposes of this discussion, I have chosen to highlight some of the commonly cited democratic principles: accountability, citizen participation, control of the abuse of power, equality, economic freedom, neutrality of state institutions, political tolerance, for example. And as we heard in the first presentation, another way of characterizing democracy is the identification of what I consider to be a shorter list of key elements. The political scientist Larry Diamond was referenced earlier. And in his writing, he indicated that democracy consists of 4 key elements: a political system for choosing and replacing the government through free and fair elections. And we hear how the systems are within the admin state can facilitate or otherwise, and how there are checks and balances. Reference was made to recent elections in the region and the checks and balances that are in place to ensure that those institutions pretty much operate within the expected parameters of our democratic ideals. The active participation of citizens in politics and civic life. Now, the reality is, because we are in a representative democracy, the notion of active participation is highly questionable in multiple circumstances. We have seen the rise, and in fact, and I would also say the demise and the weakening of civil society. That is one mechanism through which our citizens can actively participate. And therefore, beyond what I call the lowest common denominator in this notion of participation, which is voting once every 5 years in the case of Barbados and most of our jurisdiction member states of CARICOM, many citizens really and truly pay little attention to the workings of government, to the institutions which constitute the admin state, which are there to serve their interests. And the challenge therefore is that the notion of a decline in democratic principles is largely a function of what citizens are allowing to take place to a large extent, and I think that is one of the factors that will determine the extent to which we can come to a conclusion, positive or negative, for or against the notion of the rise of one and the decline of the other. Of course, we talk, as Diamond talked about political system for choosing and replacing government, and that's free and fair elections, the active participation. He also made reference to the protection of human rights of all citizens. And we know of efforts to address the rights of a cross-section of citizens. People are becoming more and more vocal in terms of demanding their rights. In Barbados, for example, one of the largest organizations in Barbados in terms of membership is an organization which caters to the retired. Barbados Association of Retired Persons. It has actually become, in the several years since it was formed, and it's an institution which you can join at 50. And I'm proud to be a life member. They don't offer that service anymore. But the organization has become one of the dominant lobbying interests in Barbados. So the notion of active participation is real, but it is often ignored and not seen as a tool, and therefore perhaps allows the institutions of state, institutions of government, to probably, quote unquote, subscribe to the decline of these democratic principles. I would say, however, that given the relationship between democracy and bureaucracy or the administrative state, an important question must be posed. And the question is, how do we achieve the objectives of the administrative state, and I would say in all its forms, while safeguarding or securing the fundamental principles of democracy? I contend that the existence of tension between bureaucracy and democracy is inevitable and can lead to the decline in democratic principles if deliberate efforts are not made to safeguard these principles. And I was going to go through some illustrations to show the possible tensions that exist and which may ultimately lead to a decline in those democratic principles, as we seek to live by in a democracy. And I was going to use the issue of accountability and equity, etc. But what I probably will do, because I know we have another speaker, is to perhaps stick a pin there and suggest that, as I said, there's an obvious and likely tension or possible tension between the democratic principles and the administrative state, and this which can lead to a decline in those principles. But I can later illustrate, should anybody want me to do so, so that I can hear from our third speaker, and then we can probably have some kind of discussion. So I'll pause there for the moment.
Thank you so much, Ms. McLean. That is a very interesting discussion. What stood out to me most is when you said how the objective, how can we achieve the objectives of the administrative state by safeguarding our democratic principles. I think that what stood out to me the most of many other important points that you would have mentioned when you mentioned civil, sorry, not civil liberty, you mentioned civil organizations, civil society. What stood out to me also in my mind is unions, and the relationship that unions may have. I'm not a anti-unionist, but unions having a relationship or a direct influence on the governance or direct special interest, basically, is what I'm trying to say. So, however, throughout this discussion, I'm hoping that we could answer your objective and how do we achieve, sorry, answer your question, how do we achieve the objective of the administrative state without interfering or safeguarding the principle of democracy? I'm not sure, maybe Mrs. Moss she can chime in and also add in there with regards to that, who will obviously introduce our next and last speaker.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, Tyson. And I just wanted to touch on the fact that what I found is almost that Ms. McLean and Ms. Sukubob's their presentations sort of echoed the same sentiments and the same sort of questions. The fact, and I do like the fact that Ms. McLean touched on the point that there is a tension. She highlighted the fact that there is a tension between the bureaucracy or administrative state and the principles of democracy. But rather than, if we're going to look at a local context and if we're going to look at our Westminster system of governance, for example, in the Bahamas, the question is, with this tension, the tension that we clearly have between bureaucracy and the principles of democracy, is then, or can we ensure that the principles of democracy isn't diminishing? And I think that kind of segues into our final speaker, Mrs. Loretta Butler Turner, and I have the privilege of introducing this speaker, this presenter, who is a fellow Bahamian, and she has been a trailblazer in many rights, not only in our country, but throughout the Caribbean. And I'll just like to go right into her background. Mrs. Loretta Butler Turner was born on January 9th, 1961, at The Pawn, an historic residential area in the city of Nassau, Bahamas. She is the granddaughter of the first Bahamian Governor General, Sir Marlow Butler, and his wife, Lady Caroline Butler. As a child, she lived with her maternal grandparents for 6 years at Clarencetown, Long Island, a pristine island located in the southern portion of the Bahamas archipelago chain. And I just wanted to touch on that. That was important to highlight because of what she ended up accomplishing later in her life. Upon her return to Nassau, she began her formal education at the Kingsway Academy and eventually graduating from St. Andrews High School. In 1987, she graduated from the New England Institute, Boston, Massachusetts, becoming the first qualified Bahamian female mortician, having attained a bachelor's degree, summa cum laude, in mortuary science and business administration. Returning to the Bahamas, she rejoined her parents in the funeral business and as a licensed funeral director, embalmer, and business administrator. For over 25 years, she helped to successfully run the family-owned funeral business. Loretta eventually shifted her focus to national politics, following the path of two generations before. She became the third generation of the Butler family lineage to enter public service and frontline politics. In 1998, she formally joined the Free National Movement, a political party, and served in various positions, including as an executive member of the Women's Association, deputy chairman of the party. She was elected to the House of Assembly for the Montague constituency in 2007, and she was appointed as Minister of State for Social Development in the cabinet of the Right Honorable Hubert Alexander Ingram. She was also reelected in the House in 2012 as a member of parliament for Long Island, the stomping ground of her grandparents. On the 23rd of May 2012, she was elected as the deputy leader of the Free National Movement, becoming the first female to hold this position. And I also want to highlight that she is a long civic political activist, a long-standing civic and political activist rather, and she has a special understanding of social, community, and family island development. She's a strong advocate for the social welfare of all Bahamians, particularly defending the rights of children, women, and those less fortunate. And her political career clearly shows this. She's especially committed to business and economic development, especially the empowerment of small and medium-sized businesses and the promotion of entrepreneurial opportunities and employment for young Bahamians, professionals, and those engaged in various trades and crafts. Loretta is married to Edward Turner, a practicing attorney at law. They are blessed with two children, Dr. Elizabeth Turner and Edward Turner III. The family resides near the same historic neighborhood, not too far from their family homestead of Sir Milo and Lady Carolyn. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our final speaker, Mrs. Loretta Butler Turner.
Good evening. Good evening, and thank you very much. Okay. Good evening. Thank you very much, Tamar, for that introduction. I think that's probably going to be longer than my contribution, but I would like to begin by just basically saying how delighted I am to be a part of this very important discussion this evening. Thank you, the moderators, and my fellow panelists, my most esteemed fellow panelists. I wanted to speak especially on the local interpretations and practices of our system of governance, which is of the Westminster system, a commonality shared by our speakers and the countries that they are from and other CARICOM nations, and also the principles of democracy and whether or not they are in fact diminishing. It is certainly from the perspective of my political participation that I will speak tonight. I think that I would be remiss if I were not to highlight the importance of the definitions, both scholarly and legal, that our first speaker presented tonight. And I thank her so much because she basically set the stage for the entire topic, it being a twofold topic: one, the administrative state, and secondly, the perceived decline of democracy. And then, of course, from a layman's standpoint, the input with regards to the tensions between the administrative state and the layperson, the democratic state, which Ms. McLean alluded to. And so I think they both set an amazing stage for me to just pivot. And I'm speaking extemporaneously because one of the things that I find is that we do not need to be redundant in the things that we present. And obviously, I believe that you as moderators would like to have open discussion at the end of these presentations. So as Ms. McLean alluded, the concept of the administrative state as we know it was first discussed by Dwight Waldo many decades ago. And, you know, I think that in his interpretation, he basically did not see it as we are interpreting it today in our instance, because you've seen the iterations of the interpretation of the administrative state. Some would almost say that it is actually more than just an administrative state, especially with this COVID pandemic that we have all experienced around the world. I think some people would, in their various countries, suggest an authoritarian type government because of the infringement on the civil liberties that they perceive they have had to endure during this past year due to COVID and the pandemic. And also, I think that the tensions that would have come from those of us who would have lived under these very constrained circumstances, thereby almost diminishing in the layman's mind and in the general population that diminishing principle of democracy. So we understood from both speakers previously the wide definition of what democracy is and how we can protect it. One of the things I may have missed, but I think is also very important, is the fourth estate, which is very much a part of democracy in the Western world, and that is the media, the press. I think it's very important. It's almost as important as the judiciary in keeping the balance, I would say, with regards to accountability and transparency. In the Bahamas, if we were to be more focused from a local standpoint, we have heard bandied about by various administrations, including the current administration, that we were going to have an introduction of the Freedom of Information Act. It has been a campaign tool used by all political organizations, thereby trying to allay the fears of the electorate with regards to transparency and accountability. Needless to say that none of that to this date has actually come to fruition. We still await the enactment of freedom of information. Freedom of information is important because obviously when people have information, they're able to better understand and make deliberate decisions based on information. And I think that when we talk about the decline of democracy, we certainly would want to know, why is it that the bureaucracy or the administrators, the authoritarian leaders are not allowing us to have the information? We have seen the judiciary, as Ms. Suku Bob alluded to, in the Bahamas actually exercise its right, the civil society used the judiciary to exercise rights to protect our democracy. We've seen it in election courts, as she has alluded to, as to what happened in Guyana. We've had our fair share of those as well in the Bahamas. We've seen it more recently in immigration matters, human rights, where the judiciary has been used as a tool to ensure that people are not denied their human rights. And most interestingly, I think, and ongoing in the Bahamas, the whole issue of oil drilling with regards to the BPC, and of course, the Save the Bays that are using the judiciary now to try and challenge the decision by successive administrations, the previous and the current, with regards to drilling in the Bahamas. And so I believe that when you talk about democracy, while we do have a representational democracy, what has happened is, in my opinion, is that we have had huge swings in terms of the electoral seats in Parliament by the electorate, thereby giving huge mandates to either of the governments that have come into power. For the last 3 to 4 election cycles, you would have seen a huge imbalance in the parliamentary system, which for me, I think is very, very important in the protection of our democracy. Because when you have a governing party with such a huge majority, their mandate can sometimes become blurred by the political machinery which they serve. In other words, individuals that are elected to Parliament tend to lose their independence in representing their constituents' interests, and their interests are more or less controlled by the political party with which they are affiliated. And you see this happening more so when you have this huge imbalance in Parliament. Right now, our our balance, I think, is 29-6 or 30-5, whatever. Anyway, it's a huge imbalance. And thereby the opposition, who really should be, along with a strong backbench, should be the conscience of Parliament, is unable to be effective. And so we see that with the introduction of COVID around the world, we have employed in the Bahamas something that is called the executive orders, which basically gives unmitigated freedoms to the Prime Minister, the office of the Prime Minister, to basically, I would say, usurp all levels of normal law in determining what methodology that he would be using to contain the COVID. I think that this has certainly highlighted this topic because people are exasperated at this point with their civil liberties being infringed upon, and with the lack of a strong opposition being able to oppose the extension of these orders effectively. While they can oppose it verbally, when it comes time to the actual vote in Parliament, they are so greatly outnumbered that it does not matter. The vote is going to carry in favor of the government. And this is where I think the whole, for my purpose and this discussion tonight, rather than just saying the administrative state, basically looking at shadows of an authoritarian state where people feel that there is very little hope of expressing their true democracy when this amount of power is reposed in one office. It almost seems to the layperson abusive of their democratic rights. And so that is why I think that this topic tonight is so important to those of us in the region, but more pointedly here in the Bahamas. And so how do we move beyond this and to arrest this and to ensure that in moving forward, as we move into an election cycle here in the Bahamas, in moving forward, how do we arrest this diminishing ability of the majority, the electorate, to stop this sort of authoritarianism that we see raising its head through the bureaucracy, through those whom we have elected to serve us. I think that one of the biggest challenges we also have is when the office of the Prime Minister wields that amount of power, rather than that office being a service to the country, people begin to fear the office. That is not good for democracy. When the elected officials who would make up the executive, meaning the cabinet ministers, meaning the legislation, those that sit in Parliament, when they feel helpless in bucking the trend, then of course I think we've reached a very dangerous precipice principle of total authoritarianism. And for me, I think that in the Bahamas, that is something we're going to have to look at very, very closely as we examine political aspirants in the upcoming election, because it is important to understand that while we have representational democracy, that democracy should not be diminished by the powers of particular offices or the powers of political organizations. And that brings me basically to the conclusion of what I would like to add to this discussion this evening, because obviously I know that from all of our panelists tonight, that there must be questions that the audience would want to pose to any number of us. And so I think that in closing, what is important for us to understand in the Bahamas in particular is that while we exercise our right to the democratic process every 5 years, every election cycle, or whenever the elections are actually called, that we must have the ability outside of that particular election day to also be able to ensure that our democratic rights are not tread upon during the administration of any particular time frame. And so, in having said that, I would like to close out, and certainly from a practitioner, a retired practitioner's position, avail myself to the audience along with my other panelists to questions. So I thank you once again to my fellow panelists and to you, the moderators, and to the audience that is participating. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Butler Turner, on that you provided some very crucial incitement there. What I think would be forgot, and as you brought it up, is the fourth estate, which is very important in our democracy as well. I really, that hit me right there, because we have a lot of, again, I would use it in a similar context of the unions and interest of the fourth estate, and Mrs. Suku Bobbitt mentioned, of course, the fourth estate with her presentation regarding, I'm not sure which country it is, but in terms of the opposition not having equal, in terms of democracy, opposition having not equal amount of fair time in terms of their plans. But there are some questions that may be yielded from the audience, well, virtual audience, let me say that much. But what I also appreciated about your presentation is how can we affect change between election cycles, which is the parliamentary system. How can we affect change, even though this is a representative democracy? How can we really affect change? And the shadows of authoritative state. All of these are things that we must engage in a discussion about, and we must not fear, but it is a true discussion that needs to be had, if I may say it like that. So if there's any person who wish to ask questions, you can either type them in the chat box, or you can add them to just use the raise hand feature, and I can, I think you can unmute yourself, but everybody should be able to unmute themselves so they can discuss. Or if there isn't any question, then either of the speaker can chime in to add or comment on another speaker, so we could engage in a discussion at this point, so we can end promptly at, we have a question. I think Mr. Dwayne Bethel, and introduce yourself if you may. Yeah. Okay, there you go, Mr. Bethel. You can talk now.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. There was an excellent presentation. I have one question. It's directed to Mrs. Butler Turner. Is the Bahamas at the crossroad to becoming an administrative state as the democracy declines due to the emergency powers orders, especially during this election mode as we prepare to go into election? Mrs. Suku Bob mentioned COVID, with respect to COVID-19, where the chief medical officer makes decisions without parliament's, without putting it to parliament. For the Bahamas, we have the prime minister, who is also known as the competent authority. We have seen in a recent history where he made such decisions. And as Ms. McLean mentioned, for COVID, these decisions could mean a means to an end to combat or to curtail the COVID-19. So again, I just wanted to know, is the Bahamas at a crossroad with respect to becoming an administrative state as democracy declines? I'll listen.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that question, Mr. Bethel. And I think that certainly the whole question of the administrative state has been magnified during the past year through the vehicle of the emergency orders and the authority reposed in the competent authority. Is the Bahamas at a crossroads? I believe it is because as I observe from the distance, the use of the emergency orders, and I think that Mrs. Suku Bob spoke to the importance of no one being above the law. And we have seen instances where persons who are within the executive, within the legislation, seem to do things and move about without any regard to the law that is being placed upon the wider public. That for me is very, very frightening. That does put us at a crossroads. It's almost a us and them type scenario. And so we do believe that, you know, in terms of the masses, the majority of persons feeling that their democratic rights, their civil liberties are being abused. And as we move into the election cycle, we also saw where the opposition in the Bahamas has questioned the hindrances placed on them to move as freely and to do as many things that the governing side is doing without being impeded. So the question for me, and the answer I feel, is certainly we are at a very crucial crossroad. We cannot continue to have an unlevel playing field in terms of the execution of these emergency orders. It's either for all of us or it's for none of us.
Thank you for that, Mr. Bethel. Was your question answered?
Yes, sir. Thank you very
Great,
much.
great. Is there any other questions? I know Mrs. Maxine, Ms. McLean might have had a illustration that she may want to chime in or present to us at this time. You're free to do that.
Yes. Before I go to those, well, I suppose the illustrations can also come from a very important point that was made by Mrs. Butler Turner, and she raised the issue of the fourth estate. And for me, that is an important consideration. I recognize that if we're talking about freedom of information, we also need to be speaking of the objective and unbiased media. That's critical, that there needs to be objectivity and unbiased actions and reporting and coverage of the news. The unfortunate reality is that is typically not necessarily always the case. In many situations, and I can speak of Barbados, that if you look over a period of time, you probably find that there is hostility. And I use the word and you know, without reservation, hostility towards you know, certain political, and I mean, I am a former politician, a former minister of government. And if you were to do a content analysis of the media coverage of successive governments, you would probably see that in terms of sharing information, reporting accurately in an unbiased, objective, professional manner, that has not necessarily always been the case. Now, what are the consequences of that from the perspective, because the role of the fourth estate, the role of the media, has to do with informing, you know, the citizen and ensuring that citizens are in a position armed with accurate information, etc. And that, to my mind, creates a problem. Now, in terms of the decline in these principles, if people are not aware of what the facts are, if certain kinds of pictures are painted, and even, for example, even the coverage of the actions of the institutions, etc., it is problematic. So I think that in terms of looking at that is critical. I mentioned the issue of the examples, accountability. Part of the accountability of government, of the institutions of government, or the role of accountability is very critical. I think it is one thing to look at what I call the form, that is the mechanisms that exist and the actual functioning of those mechanisms. Because at the end of the day, what we have is a situation where let's say you have an auditor general, you have your ombudsman. In the case of Barbados, those are two examples. You have authorities, complaint authorities, whether it is for, let's say, the police complaints authority, etc., and so on. And the question is, at the end of the day, how do these mechanisms work to address any potential abuse of authority and power? So that is one example. I can also speak of the issue of the whole question of equality. Now, when we say, I would draw a distinction between equality and equity, because at the end of the day, if we talk about impartial institutions, etc., equality suggests that when we pursue equality, the question is, how do we do that in a manner that is beneficial to all? Because at the end of the day, there's a need for government to recognize the disparities that exist among citizens and in the society. And therefore, a critical part of what we have to do is to ensure that as we strive to say that we operationalize these democratic principles, that we do so in a way that is truly equitable, and that demonstrates equality of action ultimately. In the context of Barbados, if we look at the social landscape of the country, the social policies that have been put in place over the years, in the absence of what I would call what the Americans call affirmative action, for example, that was the introduction of free secondary education several decades ago. The legislation in terms of women's right to maternity leave and all of these things. You're looking at examples of, for want of a better word, some people may consider that these are special provisions for segments of the population, but ultimately, unless you address the special needs of some elements of your population, I don't think that the best interests of the entire population is served. But I would want to, there was one other issue which Mrs. Butler Turner raised, which was of special interest to me and development, because, and that was, I think she used the term shadows of an authoritarian state. And how do we, I think the question was, how do we move beyond this to ensure that we do not see such authoritarianism creeping into our societies, which are supposed to be democratic, but which at the end of the day will be democratic in substance if we ensure that these things don't happen. And special reference was made of the power of the office of Prime Minister. And I have seen instances where we have had prime ministers, and I speak of Barbados, where an attempt was made to instill fear in persons, whether it was in fear in public officers or fear in citizens. I recently saw something play out in the media in Barbados, so around the whole issue of public information about COVID, and it is public information, so I can refer to it. You can check our media. But recently we had a young Barbadian female doctor, a health professional, commenting on how we have, as a country, rolled out our response to this pandemic. And her personal opinions, I mean, based on her professional knowledge, prompted the Prime Minister to reply to her in a very open way in an address to citizens. And there was much debate about that in terms of the need to to do so. What was concerning to me, even before the Prime Minister's response, was that you had a citizen on a national program where anonymity is considered the norm. Of course, in a small society, people know my voice and the voice of regular callers, and you get to know people. But here I saw a fellow caller who is known as a very strong partisan supporter of one of the political parties, seeking to intimidate this young woman on the radio by saying, "Why aren't you telling us your name? I've spoken to my doctor friend and he doesn't know your voice. Who are you?" I mean, and that is not the norm that is asked of persons. So in essence, there's what I call a public forum in which citizens are able to seek information, share their opinions. And here you have simply because the person is perhaps saying something that is not complementary to the developments, or the responses to the developments around the pandemic, being intimidated, hopefully intimidated into silence. So I was just using those as examples. And the thing is, if citizens allow that to happen, then what was described by our third speaker clearly is the beginnings of some very negative development, so to speak, in terms of the decline in what are our fundamental principles and rights.
Thank you, Ms. McLean. I believe that Mrs. Suku Bob wanted to also comment on that because, and as I would have think the fourth estate, I'm not sure if she's there. Yes, Ms. Suku Bob.
Thank you. And thank you to my fellow panelists, particularly for touching on the fourth estate. Because of time, I did not get to go there, but the issue of the fourth estate has been deemed by our courts, and as far back as in 1980s, as being the press being the fourth estate and one that should be protected. Coming out of a case out of Trinidad and Tobago known as Rambachan and TNT television at the time, which was the only state media, the courts recognized since then that a government in a free society must have no control over the press, and especially in the modern world, over the electronic press. The judiciary also recognized that the failure of the government to give recognized political parties an opportunity to criticize the government in the fourth estate is tantamount to a breach of the fundamental rights, not just of freedom of expression, but equality before the law, and threatens democracy as a whole. The court also went on to indicate that the government should refrain from criticizing the press. As a government, you should have a thick skin, and the government should allow for strong criticism short of defamation, because that is part of the political engine by which governments are either kept or eventually changed. Of course, and there have been cases in Anguilla and so forth, in which even though the fourth estate has been recognized via case law as being a legitimate arm of democracy, governments still continue, whether it's through denying license for independent media houses or political opposition to be able to have their own radio station or to use state-owned media. So that is a very important part of the democratic process. And particularly in COVID-19 times, speaking from the St. Kitts and Nevis perspective, St. Kitts and Nevis went through federal elections last year under state of emergency. St. Kitts had a snap election within 17 days. And of course, the government would have obviously known beforehand. We went from strict 24-hour and sometimes 48 hours lockdown into a general election in which everyone was allowed to go out and line up at the polls. And of course, the CMO, who would have been able to give the go-ahead for the elections to occur, yet businesses could not open fully and still today cannot open fully. So, and in that election, when you look at the participation of voters, particularly the aged voters. Of course, that would have been affected because of COVID-19, because persons are now getting mixed messages between stay home, only one person from your family can leave your house to go to the supermarket, with in the next 3 weeks without much change, we can all go out and vote for the government of our choice. So in my opinion, was that free and fair elections? Absolutely not. It could never have been. And of course, I alluded to the case that came out of it. In addition to that, the opposition, because COVID-19 publications were running 24/7, and the government was allowed to bring on candidates who were not elected members to speak under the guise of COVID-19, the population really did not hear from the opposition. Whether that was the only reason, I don't know, but it did result in the opposition being down to 2 and the government being up 9. So now we have a government with more than a special majority that can now amend the constitution without there being a true and proper opposition. The same thing happened in Jamaica. Jamaica was also one of those countries that had elections under state of emergency. And of course, you saw what happened there. Again, there's almost an opposition coming out of it. And you have persons who would have held on to seats for very many years, like Lisa Hanna, for example, almost win her seat. Trinidad and Tobago also had elections, but they did not have a state of emergency. Trinidad managed, up to today's date, their COVID-19 pandemic using the Public Health Act. And so that's a difference in terms of the elections in Trinidad. The same thing applied in Anguilla, where Anguilla's election, there was no state of emergency during Anguilla's election. In Trinidad, the opposition gained a lot of footage. And in Anguilla, of course, the government was overthrown and the opposition formed a new government. So whether or not the interplay between COVID-19, the passing of state of emergency, given the administrative state, which include the Prime Minister, the Governor General, technocrats such as the Chief Medical Officer or National Emergency Control, sort of carte blanche power to do as they like, to breach our rights to freedom of expression, freedom of association, under the guise that it's for our own health, and at the same time holding general elections. I think that that's a very concerning area of law, and it's one that really should be challenged as much as possible in every country in which it happens, because I do not think that you can have true democracy if, for example, in Jamaica, less than 40% of your voting population chooses the next government. Is that really a government chosen by the majority? I don't think so. Yes, I'll end there for now.
Well, I'm amazed at how much similarities that we're going through within the region. I'm amazed. You presented so much that I felt was very similar to what we're experiencing in the Bahamas. I will, of course, you know, the parameters of what I could say and what I cannot say. So I'll just leave it so as that for right now. I don't know if Mrs. Tamar Moss, because of my restrictions, if Tamar Moss would have had some insight on this.
Yes,
she would have mentioned.
Listening to Ms. Suku Bob, I had the same sentiments, and I thought, wow, it's not just us. And I believe that throughout the electorate base, that is the fair for most persons. Will we have, especially considering the COVID restrictions, the protocols in place, and the fact that we have this, overarching competent authority that at certain points, depending on the week, depending on the given month, may change things, like the colloquial expression would insist, at a drop of a dime. Will we have a fair election? Will the electoral base come out in droves and vote like in previous elections, in our case in 2017 and 2012? Or will we have a similar instance like Jamaica, like Ms. Suku Bob would have alluded to, where only 40% of the electorate came out to vote? Would that truly be basically an example of our democracy. So I like the fact that Ms. Sukubal touched on that point. And it was important to highlight that it is not just in our separate countries, but as a region, we all are sharing in the same experience. And I believe that we all must then look at that as an opportunity to basically say within our respective countries that we will be the guardians for democracy, and to ensure that it does not happen in our various jurisdictions. So I thank you for that, Ms. Sukubal.
I believe Mr. Bethel would have asked a question in the chat group. So as he said, so it would appear that not only the Bahamas is at a crossroad, based on the discussions and based on the presenters here, and especially for Mrs. Sukubob's case studies and cases, and even Ms. McLean's illustrations, I believe not only the Bahamas is not at a crossroad, more countries within the region is indeed at a crossroad if we are going with the definition that Mr. Bethel would have presented to us. With that being said, are there any other questions, any other comments persons may have to ask? Feel free to ask them. If not, then this has been a very productive discussion. Or if there's any other comments that the presenters may want to chime in.
I would just want to add, as you look at elections, we didn't have an election, but we had a by-election last year in the midst of this pandemic. And as it was described, it was an interesting by-election. It was one that wasn't necessary. It was a case where an MP has retired or being retired to take up a post as a diplomat. He's still very much here. As former foreign minister, I know the processes you go through, and all that we were told, to me, it doesn't add up, as we say, but it just was not, the person, interesting because you mentioned unions, the person who won the seat happens to be the general secretary of the largest trade union in Barbados. And so that makes for some interesting discussions as well, in terms of, the whole issue of elections, representation, the interests of the people, and so on. But that you can add to your list of elections and consequences of elections, even if it is simply a question of the impact it has had on the spread of the virus, possibly when you have political campaigns and people participating in meetings in large numbers, as we saw across the Caribbean in recent times. So it's one of the question is elections, and then fair elections. Again, it's form and substance, which I think is important.
I just wanted to add.
Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to add, I think that in the context of the Bahamas, and I'm glad that both of my fellow panelists rejoined the discussion with regards to the fourth estate and the importance of that. I think that in the context of the Bahamas, it is important for us to also note the legislation, and this is one of the challenges I think that we have as a country. Not sufficient persons are as familiar with laws and the creation of laws and the legislation and how it comes to being. So interestingly, over the past few months, in preparation for this general election, which is mandated to be held by 2022 or sooner, the government has exercised its legislative rights to create new legislation with regards to our electoral process, given that there are now passed laws that we now have a permanent register. This, for me, in the Bahamas, is not, my criticism is not to impede progress, but my question would be, given the questions that arise from our particular circumstances as it relates to Hurricane Dorian, and the amount of individuals that we have yet to account for whose lives would have been lost. And with this permanent register, I find it to be a very critical question. Why are we moving into this permanent register at this time with so many questionable individuals that may appear on that list that we still have not yet accounted for? So in terms of democracy and free and fair elections, I think that for the electorate, this is going to be a very important question. There are many mutterings in the public that people will not participate in the election this time. You know, probably a very low turnout of voters. I think that is going to be a huge impact on our democracy if that in fact happens, because the Bahamas prides itself really on very high voter participation. So if this precedent is set in the next election cycle, I think that it will only help to diminish our democratic principles even more. And so these are questions that need to be answered, that need to be examined more fully by those of us that are going to be voting and reposing our representational votes in the hands of, you know, either a current administration or a new administration.
Yes, indeed. I have a question for Ms. Suku Bob with regards to the Public Health Act that Trinidad would have implemented. With this Health Act, does it mean that their emergency orders may not have been as, what is the word, as, I guess, crucial or important?
Stringent.
Stringent. Thank you. That's the word. Thank you. That's the word. So because they have a legislation that would have take care of majority of what emergency acts are having. So can you explain that for a bit for me, if you can?
Okay. So in most Commonwealth countries, we have very similar legislation. And so in most countries, you would have inherited from the UK a public health ordinance, which would have eventually become a public health act. And really and truly, the ability to quarantine individuals, that power does not come from a state of emergency. A state of emergency allows you to infringe upon one's right to freedom of movement and to discriminate, but it does not allow you to quarantine per se. It does not allow you to test person. It does not test person in terms of to check whether or not they have COVID-19, for example. It does not allow you to shut down borders or prevent ships from coming in. It does not allow you to determine which businesses should operate or to limit business hours. Those powers actually comes from your respective Public Health Act. So there was actually not necessarily a need for a state of emergency, which is the most, it's almost like your atomic bomb that you have that you can use in the worst situation, but your Public Health Act is what will give you a measured approach to deal with the situation. So for example, in each country, in March, when we found out that COVID-19 was in the Caribbean, no one may have known how much community spread there was, if there was at all. So perhaps at that stage, a state of emergency may have been necessary in order to sort of prevent community spread. But once you pass that, that 14-day period, and most constitutions give the Governor General between up to 21 days to have a state of emergency before you have to go to Parliament, then each individual country's Public Health Act could have been initiated to then manage the virus properly. So in countries like St. Kitts and St. Lucia, where States of Emergencies Act will pass, the oppositions tried to indicate that, well, you know, why go to your most serious weapon in your arsenal when this could be managed properly without the need to go there? And you can still, for example, depending on areas, you can still limit persons' movement without a carte blanche suppression of fundamental rights and freedoms, so that, especially I think in St. Lucia, they should have had elections, or elections are coming up sometime, and there was an intention to have elections last year as well. But to answer the question, I think not. I think the countries that decided to invoke states of emergencies did so perhaps with additional ambitions behind it. And so one always have to ask the question, when you can manage a virus, when you can manage an issue like COVID-19 without depriving individuals of their rights, and you go to the extreme, why would one do that? And then what is the rationale for it?
Thank you for that. Tamar, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, Ty.
I guess you could read Dr. If you have access to the chat, I guess you could read Dr. Curry's comment there.
Okay.
And we could wrap up after that.
Okay, certainly. And Dr. Chris Curry would have stated, there's another particular scenario in the Bahamas where displaced persons from Hurricane Dorian are possibly disenfranchised by virtue of being removed from their island domicile and unable to return. Even when returning to Grand Bahama or Abaco, they may not have a residence, in quotations, an actual abode, and therefore may be disenfranchised. How does the authoritative functioning of the state impede democracy in light of a natural disaster and impending general election? So I guess that's a question for the panel because it hadn't been assigned to anybody.
Jump in and answer that. I think that in essence, the question answers itself, because those are very important fundamentals in the electoral process, and the government, the administrative arm, bureaucracy, needs to be very clear on that before they even venture into a general election. That any individual is disenfranchised is not going to be representational of the democratic process, in my opinion.
That is definitely a situation which should be litigated, because as I said, the right to vote is sacrosanct. And if given that there are some super intervening circumstances that would lead to someone not being physically resident somewhere, then if a government is at that point is able to pass a law, the effect of which would be to disenfranchise them, then that's something that I think a constitutional challenge should definitely be launched at. And there are cases in which even persons who are nomads living in tents out in a particular area have the rights to vote. So that is something that I would definitely encourage persons to bring a challenge, whether it is to ask for declaration beforehand or, well, after the fact, if necessary, to ensure that persons are kept enfranchised and laws are not made for the specific purpose of disenfranchising an entire island or a significant portion of the island.
All right, thank you. We will entertain wrap-up questions from our panelists, if anybody can. I guess we could start with you, Ms. McLean, if you want, or since Mrs. Sugubal has the floor, she can just wrap up right now at one time.
I just want to say that we all have a part to play in ensuring that democracy remains the order of day. It is not any one individual responsibility, it's a collective responsibility. Becoming informed as well as using our information and spreading our information is key. You cannot manage something that you don't know about, and you cannot enforce rights that you are not aware that you have. And so I would just encourage everyone to continue to read as well as to spread what is a democracy, why is it important, not just from a legal perspective, but from a layman's perspective, because democracy is something that touches each and every one of us and generations to come. And if we don't continue to stand up and fight for it to remain in a balanced society, then we can very well end up in an autocratic state if we're not already heading down a very despotic road as a region. Thank you.
Okay, I guess I should go next. What I would want to say as a kind of final comment has to do with the role of citizens, and as you pointed out, Mrs. Suku Bob, it is important that we as citizens, as individuals, ensure that we play our part to maintain the democratic ideals that we say we live by and our systems are supposed to be imposed. Information is key there. I have a major concern though as I engage fellow Barbadians of various ages, especially younger Barbadians. And it has to do with this notion that I mentioned that we are and period that we are living in, and a lot of it has to do with social media and what people take as valuable information. I think that in a lot of ways people have, you know, access to so much information, but it is becoming to a large extent less than adequate information as we think in terms of, you know, maintaining our democratic ideals and living under the best systems of democracy we can. And so for me, a major struggle would be to have citizens continue to be adequately educated, not only of their rights, but of the systems that are supposed to ensure those rights, etc. And therefore, the onus is on all elements of, or all parts of our democracy, state institutions, individual citizens, organizations, etc., to address the issue of information sharing, information access to information, etc., in a way that is meaningful, that in a way that is sufficient and adequate in ensuring that we continue to be properly informed citizens so that we can act on the basis of that information, accurate, timely information, etc.
I guess I'm the final panelist. Once again, I just want to thank you both, my fellow panelists. I think that you've presented amazing discussion points for all of us. But I want to just close out by talking to the vulnerability that has been created within all of our societies, vulnerability of individuals, given the fact that people are either unemployed, underemployed, and the impact that an election season, or even outside of an election season, the impact that the administrative state can have on the lives of individuals. It is important to understand that the elected officials are the servants, they are not the masters of our democracy. And as in the Bahamas, as we move into the electoral season, it is important to also note that there are no favors being handed out, whether it is the use of state-owned vehicles and resources. And people, once again, must understand that as contributors in our society, as individuals in our society, we are all equitably have the rights to receive whatever the state offers. It is not a special favor given to any of us by any particular government or minister. So I think that as we close out and we look forward in the Bahamas to elections, and we look at the impact also of social media and what many people now, as we look in the States, you know, refer to as fake news, you've got to be fully informed of the truth. The truth is the most important thing. There are many methodologies in media today that people will use to portray what it is that they would like for you to believe. And I think an informed decision maker is going to be the best person in moving forward in preserving our democratic principles. So having said that, I think that we as citizens of the region and of the world must be able to disaggregate all of the false information that will be thrown at us, whether it's concerning vaccines, whether it's concerning elections, but whatever it is that concerns us as individuals and as communities, we've got to be on top of our game in being truthfully informed. Thank you very much for allowing me to be a part of this discussion tonight.
Thank you, Ms. Butler-Turner. Thank you, Ms. McLean. Thank you, Ms. Suku Bob. This has indeed been a very good discussion and very timely discussion. And I believe that we should continue it at some point in time in the future as we all embark upon our various, as the Bahamas embark upon the general election and various things that's happening in our society. I am very ecstatic to announce that we will have a final and third part of this lecture. Hopefully, Ms. Suku Bob and Ms. McLean could also get the link and share it within your networks. The last one will be on the role of international treaties on local democracy. So I think I see Ms. McLean is nodding her head, so hopefully she will chime in terms of logging on as we gather our regional discussions, and hopefully Mrs. Loretta Butler-Turner and Mrs. Angelina Gracie Bob would be able to avail themselves to also log on and chime in where possible. So again, everybody, thank you for logging on. Thank you for being a part. Thank you to Mr. Tamar Moss and being my co-moderator. Very, very special thank you to Dr. Christopher Curry, who would have made all of this possible. And also thank you to the University of the Bahamas, School of Social Sciences, the chair, Dr. Nicolette Bethel, who would have agreed, my old professors, Dr. Carolyn Roll, Ethegra Simonet, and also Mrs. Dr. Yvette Neary, all who I'm pretty sure, very ecstatic that persons who are part of the system now working in the government system. So we look forward to the next discussion. And again, please keep in touch with the university. This recording also, two things. Persons are asking for the cases, Mrs. Suku Bob, that you can email that we can reference. I hope you haven't inspired somebody to take somebody to court to have some kind of reference, but that's all I'm going to say. That's all I'm going to say. And also the cases that everybody would have used. And if you have a written presentation, you could share it, and the university would share it amongst everybody else. So just if anybody has anything, just contact the School of Social Sciences at the University of the Bahamas. And this recording will be uploaded via the Facebook page in due course for those who might not have started from the beginning. So thank you. We do have to catch curfew. So I am going to be logging off in a very short order. So I will not be a victim of anything other than not breaking the law, considering what's happening right now. So it's been a good discussion. And if there's any other questions, you can just email me via whatever through the School of Social Science. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. My curfew was 7 o'clock, so I'm indoors.
Wow. Oh, okay. I have an hour left. Enjoy.
Take care.
Thank you.